You're kicking hard, but you're hardly moving. That is how current diving turns dangerous fast, because the harder most divers fight it, the worse the dive gets. In this video, I'll show you how to spot dangerous current before you enter the water, move with it instead against it, and know when to call the dive before it turns into a real problem. Let's start with the part that decides the whole dive before you even enter the water. Current rarely feels random when you know what to look for. It follows patterns driven by tides, topography, wind, swell, and local geography. But here's the trap. Many divers do not plan around current. They check the weather, show up at the site, and then act surprised when the water is moving harder than expected. That is where the danger starts before the dive even begins. So the goal is not to guess. The goal is to stack the odds in your favor with information that actually helps you predict what the site may do. Start with the tide. Tide tables help you understand when the water is rising, falling, and changing direction. For many dive sites, your best diving window is near slack tide, when the water slows before it changes direction. Slack often happens near high tide or low tide, but the tide tables show water height, not current speed. That makes them useful, but not perfect. Use them as a planning tool, but not a guarantee. When available, check current predictions for the actual dive site, channel, inlet, pass, or current station. Not to mention wind and recent rain. This matters because two dive sites in the same general area can behave very differently based on recent conditions or current conditions. One may be calm during a certain tide, while another may still be ripping because of how water is forced through the terrain. Current predictions give you a better sense of speed and direction, which is much more useful than knowing tide height. Then layer in local knowledge. Talk to local divers, dive shops, boat crews, or anyone who actually dives that site often. Some sites have a very short slack window. Some barely have slack at all. And some sites become much less forgiving if you miss that timing. Once you know the predicted slack time, plan your dive around that window. A common starting point is roughly 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after the slack. That does not mean the site will automatically be safe during the entire window, but it gives you a better chance of entering, diving, and exiting while the water is still mostly manageable. But of course, wind, swell, and local geography can still shift what actually happens in the water. So treat the timing as part of the plan, not the whole plan, just a part of it. One more factor to watch for is the moon cycle. Around new moons and full moons, spring tides usually create a stronger tidal exchange. That often means stronger current. Around quarter moons, neap tides are often gentler. But of course, that doesn't mean spring tides are always undiveable or neap tides are always easy. It means that during spring tide periods, you should expect the site to demand more caution. Slack may be shorter, the current may build faster, and the dive may be less forgiving if you are late. Miss the window, and you may be fighting the full force of that moving water. But timing is only half the plan. The next question is where the current will be weaker. Because in strong current, your best plan is not to be stronger in the ocean. It is to know where the ocean gives you protection. Before you dive, study the shape of the dive site. Look for walls, pinnacles, large boulders, reef structures, channels, sand patches, and anything else that changes how the water moves. Current does not move evenly across a dive site. Terrain can create differences in current called breaks, eddies, and protected areas where the flow slows down. Those areas become your rest stops. Sometimes they become the entire dive plan. A wall, pinnacle, or large reef structure may block enough current that the dive feels calm, even when it's ripping outside of it, if you stay in that protected area. But if you drift out of that protection, the same site can feel completely different. Knowing that feature exists before you descend changes the entire dive plan. You are no longer hoping for conditions to be manageable, you are moving intentionally through the dive site. Your team briefing needs to include current specifically. Do not only talk about max depth, turn pressure, and where you plan to go, talk about the current. What direction do you expect to move? Where are the protected areas? What conditions are acceptable? What conditions mean the dive is over? Agree on clear signals. There's too much current. We have to abort. Also agree if anyone on the team is uncomfortable that the whole team leaves together. No exceptions. That does not mean panic. It means good team judgment on every individual on that team. It's better to end the dive early than leave it with an emergency. Current dives are not the place to pressure someone into pushing farther just because the dive was planned. You should also use more conservative gas limits than usual. Current increases workload. Workload increases breathing rate, and breathing rate burns gas. So do not plan to dive like it will be effortless and margin for error. And if you know the direction of the current and you need to press against the current, plan the first part of your dive to be kicking against the current, and then towards the other half, then you can drift back to your starting point. It's usually the better strategy because you'll be tired at the end of the dive and be more relaxing ascending back up. And finally, agree on a separation protocol before you enter. In current, separation can happen fast. One diver stops for a photo, another keeps moving. One diver kicks a little harder, or one diver gets pushed wide, or goes to a different depth, which has different current at that depth. Suddenly, the team is split, and closing that distance is no longer simple. A solid default is to look briefly, only if it is safe, then begin a controlled ascent according to your training and your dive plan. If conditions call for it, deploy your DSMB, or Delayed Surface Marker Buoy, during the ascent so boats can track you. If by some chance the plan has changed and you're now moving away from your originally planned dive site, or you're blown away by the current, deploy that DSMB as soon as you can. Take your time ascending up. You still need to do your stops, but you don't need to be rushed. Usually, as long as you deployed your surface marker buoy and you're keeping it tight, you'll see the boat come to your buoy and then you can just relax. But one thing to keep in mind, current diving is not a guided tour where you blindly follow someone else's plan. It requires you to actively assess conditions, make decisions, and adapt in real time. You are not a passenger. You and your team become the pilot. When you plan correctly though, you do not spend the whole dive fighting current. You spend the dive moving through the site intelligently. And that is exactly what we are going to do next, because even with good planning, your body still has to move through moving water. And if you're enjoying this video, now is a great time to like and subscribe. If you find this information valuable, please do share it with others. And by the way, I have a free monthly newsletter to keep you up to date with the latest and greatest of the scuba industry. Check it out in the comments below, and I'll see you there. But even with good planning, you still have to get through that water. If you try to win a tug of war with the ocean, you will lose. Most divers lose that fight in a predictable way. They swim straight into the flow, burn gas, get stressed, and then start making rush decisions. I know very well because I made that mistake as a newer diver. Instead of treating current like a wall, treat it like a map. Read it, use it, and move with it intentionally. And always try to stay calm and relaxed. The first principle is simple. Do not swim straight into the current unless you absolutely have to. Use angles. If the current is pushing from your left, you instead of going straight at it, you want to go at an angle and drift this way, and then you go this way, and you basically work your way up, zigzagging in the direction that you need to go. You may drift a little sideways, but you can still make progress with much less effort. Think of it like a tacking sailboat. You trade a perfect straight line for efficiency. And in current, efficiency matters more than pride. And you also might be wondering, what is a reasonable limit that most divers can effectively still dive and kick against? And so reasonably, for most people, I would consider 0.7 knots kind of on the upper end of kind of annoying. You can still dive against it. You can still do a nice dive against 0.7 knots and enjoy it. Above 0.7 knots, maybe to 0.7 to 1.5 knots, it starts getting, wow, this is kind of tough. You're going to have to work. You're going to be winded, and it's going to really make you fight to stay at the dive site. So usually my rubric is if it's above 1, is probably better off as a drift dive or something, or you need to start looking for shelter. And supposedly, if you're decently fit, you can probably kick against a sustained 2 knots for a little bit of time. But you will get very winded, and the dive will get very dangerous with trying to kick against that for more than a minute or two. So 2 knots is kind of where my cut line is, that a very fit diver can kick against it. You can, maybe not for very long, but you can for a very limited amount of time. Anything above 2 is just better to call it a drift dive. You're not going to kick against that. That's a mental rubric in my head. For most beginners, I usually recommend 0.4 or less, but you'll have to kind of feel it out. And when you're trying to look at the tide tables and the current, you can kind of predict how much current there will be, and you can find what you feel comfortable with. Definitely start off with as low amount of current as possible so you can start getting a feel for it and work your way up the more experience you get. But when you do inevitably find yourself in current, let's talk about what to do. Aside from the zigzag motion of going through it, you also want to get low if it's appropriate and safe. Definitely not at expense of wildlife or coral. Current is often stronger higher in the water column, while terrain near the bottom can create a slower layer of water. And you will find that finning against current will make you tired very fast, so it could be a good idea to grab a rock or put your hands in the sand and take some rest because you will be able to hold yourself kind of like you're rock climbing and just relax for a little while. So especially if the bottom is sand or rock, you can use that for careful positioning to reduce the workload. But if you're overliving reef, stay off of it. Do not grab coral, kneel on coral, or crawl across it. Protect our environment. If divers don't care to protect the environment, nobody will. So we use the environment without abusing it. If you're in a region where reef hooks are commonly used, only use it if it is allowed and you can anchor on a bare rock or dead substrate. Never hook onto living coral. If the current is not constant and the water is surging with wave action, time your effort. Do not fight every push and pull. Wait for easier movement, move during the lull, and hold position when the surge returns. Stop behind a structure, look ahead for your next protected spot, and then move a short deliberate burst to the next protection. Rest again, and then repeat. That is how you avoid turning the entire dive into one long exhausting kickside. And it's worth noting that current is not always the same universally across a dive site. Towards the surface, it can be affected by high winds. And so current is often very strong at the surface and can, just off the surface, calm down considerably. And there can be interesting rivers in the water itself. And those flows can just be like a few meters or 10 feet across. And if you are just moving out of the direction that's pushing you, you can get out of it. Sometimes these currents can be pushing sideways or even up or down. So it's important to kind of identify where that push is coming from, especially around like terrain features. Maybe there's like a small mountain or something in front of you and the current is pushing up and over, rolling over it. And while it's rolling over, it's just going to suck you down. But all you have to do is kind of move away from that, like that tsunami that's going downward like a waterfall, and then you'll be fine. You'll be out of that downward current. But it can feel scary in the moment. You just always have to train and practice to try and move out of those currents, those rip tides. But if you get used to the zigzagging, you will almost feel natural to it. And back to terrain, reef structures are your best friends in current. A pinnacle that rises 3 meters or 10 feet off the bottom can create a current shadow on the downstream side. If you tuck into the protected side, the flow will drop dramatically. Walls can work in the same way. Large boulders are very effective in the same as well. Even small changes in terrain can matter. The key is to keep asking where the current is coming from, where it is weaker, where your next place to stop is, and where your team or buddy is. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's important to stress that teamwork is even more important in current. If you only have one photographer in a group, everyone's staying and waiting for that photographer. You must all move as a team and keep that situational awareness on your team at all times. The moment someone goes missing, things can go sideways really fast. And that's when you commence your party separation protocol, where you search for 1 minute, and if you can't find each other, then you deploy your DSMB and meet at the surface. You can customize your protocol, but that can be between you and your party. Also, when diving current, fin choice can matter too. Use fins you can control precisely without overworking. You do not need the stiffest fin in the world, but stiffness does help. You need a fin that lets you move efficiently, hold position, and make small adjustments without burning yourself out. Often, soft fins or fins that are easy to move or easy on the knees tend to be less effective in current, so keep that in mind. You want to test it in easier conditions before relying on it in a heavy flow. Breathing control is also critical. When you work hard, your instinct is to breathe hard. But hard breathing in current creates a negative feedback loop. You breathe faster, you use gas faster. You use gas faster, you notice the gas dropping, you get more stressed, and then you breathe even faster. Break that loop early, find shelter, stop moving, stabilize, and take long controlled breaths until your breathing comes back down. If you cannot calm your breathing, that is information. Too much carbon dioxide in your system can start leading to overstress, an intense headache, and even panic if the situation continues. Not to mention bad choices. So, if you're getting to that point, it may mean the dive needs to end. And you will be the better diver to make that decision. Tell your group that I'm not okay and thumb the dive. Current diving is a chess game, not a sprint. You avoid working hard whenever possible. Every move is deliberate. Every rest is strategic. And if you do this well, you do not just end the dive with more gas, you end the dive with more options. And the options are what keep a problem from becoming an emergency. Because the moment something goes wrong in current, the situation can escalate faster than most divers expect. So now, let's talk about what to do when it goes sideways. Here is the blunt truth. In current, small problems do not stay small. A loose fin strap can become a party separation. A minor free flow can become a gas problem. A moment of stress can turn into rapid breathing. And the current keeps you pushing while you troubleshoot. So you need a simple plan that works under pressure. If you see your buddy or your teammate struggling, do not leave them isolated. Get close, signal clearly, find shelter if you can. And if the safest move is to end the dive, abort as a team. Stay close enough to help. If they are out of gas, panicking, or overloaded, you need to be within reach. And that is where training and comfort in the water matter. Not because training makes you fearless, but training gives you something to do when your brain wants to rush. One decision that matters in current is your entry. Understand the difference between positive and negative entries. A positive entry means you enter at the surface, get organized, and then descend. That works well when the surface is manageable. A negative entry means you descend immediately after entering, without spending time floating on the surface. In strong surface current, a negative entry can reduce the chance of being swept away off the dive site before the dive even starts. But it requires control. Everyone needs to be ready before entering. Masks on, regulators in, gas checked, weights in place, computers ready, buddy ready, team ready, and mentally ready to descend as a team. Not to mention, gas pressed out of your BCD. A negative entry is not something to improvise because the current looks intense. Discuss it before the dive. If one diver is not comfortable with it, that matters. If you get swept off the site or disoriented, simplify the plan. Stop, stabilize, signal your buddy, and if you cannot safely and quickly return to the intended site, begin a controlled descent and abort the dive. Ideally, deploy a DSMB as soon as you can and when you can do it safely. That marker will help the boats at the surface see you so you don't get too far and to the point where the boat can no longer see your DSMB. But do not wait for a stressful current dive to learn how to deploy a DSMB. That's not when you learn. Practice in calm water until it is routine. Fumbling with a spool in current while managing buoyancy, breathing, depth, and situational awareness is not the time to be figuring it out. And pre-dive abort criteria matter even more in current. If the current exceeds what you planned for, call it. If your buddy is uncomfortable, call it. If your team cannot stay together, call it. If breathing gets out of control, call it. No ego. No pushing through just because you already entered. The ocean does not care how much you wanted to see the reef. Current diving is not about being fearless. It is about being prepared. And with some knowledge and practice of understanding, reading tide charts, knowing the moon phase, knowing the wind, when you get to the dive site, reading how much surf there is and predicting how much surge there will be is all part of the factors. And by the way, there is some relation, but I also wanted to mention surge, which is slightly different in current, where current is kind of like a moving river and surge is more of a swell that goes up and down. But surge kind of, instead of being a constant force of motion, it will go in and out. So maybe left to right, up and down. It can go in a bunch of different ways, but it will kind of push you back and forth. And it kind of feels a little bit funky, like you're kind of being moved around without your willing. The best way and most relaxed way to push through surge is to kick during when it's easiest, and not when it's pushing you the opposite direction, but when it's pushing you in the direction you want to go. Move with the flow. And for boat dives, you also have the ability to stick your head in the water. Look around for some known fish. Look which way they're facing, and usually fish will swim into the current. So if you see the fish swimming, you kind of know the direction of the current, which is pretty cool. You can also look for kelp or coral, or soft coral especially, which will be whipping with the current. And depending on how fast the fish are moving or how fast things are whipping around, you can kind of get a ballpark idea. It's going to take some practice, a ballpark idea of how strong the current is. But all those factors kind of arm you with enough information to understand what you're getting into. It's not foolproof, but gives you an idea. And here is the upside of current. Maybe we should have started with it. Current dives are some of the best dives I've ever been on. It's usually how you see the big stuff, the big animals. Big animals aren't affected by the current as much as we are. And if you want to see those big animals up close, you have to be a little okay with a little bit of current. Of course, that's something to work up to, and it takes practice, patience. But once you have these systems, current stops being a scary surprise. It becomes something you recognize early, manage calmly, and exit before it turns into a bad day, while still seeing some really amazing stuff on some great dives. Ultimately, current dives opens doors to sites that other divers skip. Walk through prepared and you'll come up from those dives feeling capable and alive. So what's your experience of current? Did I miss any tips that you swear by? Let us know in the comments below. If you're interested in learning more about drift diving, I have a perfect video for you to watch next here. Or maybe you want to learn more about negative diving in terms of being prepared, check out this video here. The more you know, the more you'll love and protect the ocean. Until next time.